7 Azure HIPAA compliance mistakes healthcare teams make. Hey, welcome. In this video, we're breaking down 7 Azure HIPAA compliance mistakes healthcare teams make. Let's get into it. Next up, now, why Azure HIPAA compliance breaks down before implementation. The core problem isn't Azure's capabilities. Azure offers a solid foundation for HIPAA-compliant cloud infrastructure, including dedicated services with detailed technical safeguard support. The problem is that Azure HIPAA compliance requires deliberate configuration, signed agreements, and ongoing governance. Teams that treat it as a feature they can turn on run into serious trouble. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, covered entities and their business associates must implement both technical and administrative safeguards. Moving patient data to the cloud doesn't transfer the compliance obligation. It creates a shared responsibility model where Azure covers the physical and some infrastructure level controls, but your team still owns the application layer, access controls, audit logging, and more. The 7 mistakes below each map to a gap in that shared responsibility. Fix them before deployment, not after. Let's talk about next up, mistake 1, skipping or delaying the business associate agreement. The first mistake teams make is touching patient data in Azure before signing a business associate agreement with Microsoft. A signed BAA is the legal foundation of Azure HIPAA compliance. It is a contract that defines how Microsoft, acting as a business associate, will protect your protected health information. Without one, you're out of compliance the moment any PHI enters an Azure environment, regardless of how well you've configured the services. Microsoft offers a BAA as part of the Microsoft Products and Services Agreement and through the Azure portal for eligible customers. The BAA process is not automatic. You have to actively accept it. Many teams skip this step during a rushed proof of concept phase and then forget to formalize it before moving to production. Microsoft's official Azure compliance documentation details the BAA scope and which services fall under it. Read it before you write your first pipeline. Now, moving on to mistake 2, deploying services outside the BAA coverage list. Signing the BAA doesn't automatically cover every Azure service. Microsoft's BAA covers a specific list of services. If you route PHI through a service not on that list, you're creating a gap in your Azure HIPAA compliance posture. This catches teams out during integration work. A developer building an Azure Healthcare Data Pipeline might use a preview service or a newer Azure offering that hasn't yet been added to the BAA coverage list. Azure Cognitive Services, Azure OpenAI Service, and certain Logic Apps connectors have had varying BAA coverage at different points in time. What to do? Before adding any service to your architecture, check the current Microsoft Azure HIPAA BAA Service Scope page. This list is updated periodically. Build it into your architecture review checklist as a mandatory step. Next up, now, mistake 3, leaving encryption half configured. Encryption is required under HIPAA's technical safeguards, and Azure provides strong encryption options across its services. The mistake isn't that teams skip encryption entirely. It's that they configure it partially and assume the rest is handled automatically. Each gap is an Azure HIPAA compliance risk that auditors will flag immediately. Here's where teams typically go wrong. What to do? Use Azure Policy to enforce encryption standards across your subscription. Apply CMK for any storage account, database, or service holding PHI. Set a policy that flags any new resource creation without CMK enabled before it goes live. Now, next up, mistake 4, building a HIPAA data pipeline without audit trails. HIPAA requires audit controls that track who accessed PHI, when, and what they did with it. Azure HIPAA compliance mandates this at every point in the data lifecycle, not just at the database layer. This is one of the most commonly missed requirements in HIPAA data pipeline implementations. Teams building Azure Healthcare Data Pipelines with Azure Data Factory, Logic Apps, or Event Hubs often focus on the data flow and skip the logging setup entirely. The result is a pipeline that moves data correctly but leaves no trace of who triggered it, what records it processed, or whether any failures exposed incomplete data to downstream systems. Audit logging gaps that create HIPAA exposure. Now, moving on to mistake 5, over-permissioned access to patient data. Role-based access control is one of the most powerful tools in Azure HIPAA compliance, and one of the most misused. The most common mistake is assigning overly broad roles during development and never tightening them before production. We see this pattern constantly. A developer needs quick access to a storage account during a sprint, so they're given the storage blob data contributor role on the entire account. That role stays in place after the sprint ends, across environments that now contain real PHI. HIPAA's minimum necessary standard requires that access to PHI is limited to what each user or system needs to perform their specific function. That maps directly to the principle of least privilege in Azure RBAC. Now, next up, mistake 6, treating Azure HIPAA compliance as a one-time checkbox. Azure HIPAA compliance is not a project you complete and move on from. It's an ongoing operational discipline. Teams that treat it as a one-time implementation task consistently fall out of compliance within 6 to 12 months, usually because new resources are created without the right controls or policies drift quietly over time. Healthcare data governance in Azure requires. The teams that maintain solid Azure HIPAA compliance long-term treat it like security patching. It's scheduled, documented, and someone specific owns it. Now, next up, mistake 7, poor network segmentation in healthcare cloud workloads. The 7th mistake is treating your Azure healthcare environment like a flat network where every service can communicate with every other service freely. HIPAA's access control requirements mean that services handling PHI should be isolated from general-purpose workloads. In practice, teams put PHI handling APIs and non-PHI application components in the same virtual network with no segmentation between them. A breach affecting one component can then reach PHI systems directly. That's a failure in both your security posture and your Azure HIPAA compliance documentation. Network mistakes that break HIPAA-compliant cloud setups. Now, moving on to building an Azure HIPAA compliance architecture that holds up. Getting Azure HIPAA compliance right is not about picking the most expensive services or building the most complex architecture. It's about consistent application of a relatively small set of controls, applied from the start. Here's what a solid baseline looks like for a healthcare data pipeline on Azure. This structure is achievable for most healthcare SMBs without a dedicated compliance team. The key is building it into your architecture from day one, not retrofitting it 6 months after go-live when the first audit arrives. Next up, let's talk about conclusion. Azure HIPAA compliance failures almost always come down to the same root causes: missing BAA coverage, encryption and access control gaps, absent audit trails, and the mistaken belief that compliance is a setup task rather than an ongoing responsibility. These 7 mistakes are fixable. The honest challenge is that most teams don't discover them until an audit or, worse, an incident forces the issue. If your organization is building or reviewing a healthcare data pipeline on Azure, start with the BAA, validate your service list, and work through each control area in order. Q Services works with healthcare SMBs and enterprise teams to design and implement Azure environments that meet HIPAA requirements and stay compliant as the architecture grows. Get in touch with our team to talk through your specific situation.